Okay, thank you so much. Make sure I know how everything works here. Okay, just making sure. All right, so the talk I'm going to be giving is based on the research from my book. I kind of distilled it and also tried to connect it to the present moment. And so where I'm going to begin is how we usually understand or learn about the history of child labor, kind of the narrative that maybe it's in our minds or that we learn in school. It's usually told as a narrative of progress. So that story goes something like this. A long time ago, in a time before progress, in America's factories and coal mines, tenements, and other places of employment, America's children and young people toiled away for meager wages. Instead of attending school, it was often dangerous conditions. And it was just really terrible. The American public, thankfully, realized that this situation was not okay. And so, because the national conscience always tends to do the right thing, they came together and they decided to abolish child labor. This narrative of progress usually concludes with the passage of the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act that was signed into law by President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was the law that gave us our first kind of federal protections, federal child labor laws to be upheld by the Supreme Court in 1941. And that is how child labor was abolished. That's the end. You didn't know it was going to be so short, right? I said a brief history. Okay, and so while that story is not completely it's not based on nothing, right? There is some truth to that story. It simply does not capture what really happened. So what is it that really happened, right? That's the basis of my book. So the key facts are that child labor was actually a contentious battle that lasted for more than 100 years of American history. Yes, there was a movement to end child labor. However, there was also an opposition movement, and that's the one I think people don't know about. There was a movement to prevent reform, a movement to preserve child labor. And that opposition movement was in its own right a social movement. It's just not the one we hear the story about. Federal regulations were secured in 1938, that's true, in the Fair Labor Standards Act, but there was a lot of opposition that remained, and that opposition did not just sort of go away. They're still around, if you haven't noticed. There were fundamental disagreements about free market capitalism, about labor, about the role of government in American life, and the private family, especially parental rights, that remained unresolved. Okay, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about, when this battle over child labor began, and sort of how to understand the movement and the opposition movement that arose. So although children have always worked, the movement to abolish child labor, even calling it child labor, was not something that happened until the decades after the Civil War. So we're talking about the 1870s to the around 1900. During that period, both the North and the South experienced rapid industrialization. Coal mining and textile production became major industries, as did petroleum, steel, glass, electricity, and many others. As that economic landscape was transformed, the labor force that made industry possible was also transformed. That means that a working class developed, right? A vastly expanded working class in America became a new reality, and this working class included millions of rural Americans that were searching for jobs, and millions of newly arrived immigrants that were also searching for work. How widespread was child labor? Well, the number of children under the age of 15 that worked in industrial jobs for wages climbed from about 1.5 million in 1890 to 1.75 million in 1900. By 1910, more than 2 million American children younger than the age of 15 were employed. Often these children were working in dangerous conditions that were hazardous to their health, and they did so for extremely low wages. I'm just going to show you a few images of child labor. These photographs are famously taken by Lewis Hine. You may have seen many of them. This is an immigrant mother and her children working in a New York City tenement in 1911. Tenement houses were known for being very crowded, having poor ventilation, and the children, were working for piece rate. They were under time pressure, to get a lot of work done, because that, how much they were able to get done determined how much they got paid as a family. This is a glass factory. Boys between 19 and 16 in an Indiana glass factory in 1908. A glass factory like this, probably would have had a 50 to 60 hour work week. They were very hot, they were dirty, very dangerous conditions. There were furnace rooms that the children would be working in, and often in the summer is when the most of them were employed, so it was even hotter because of the summer months. Okay, these are breaker boys between the ages of 8 and 12 working in a Pennsylvania coal mine in 1911. The main job of a breaker boy was to separate the coal, to get the impurities out, right? If there were any dirt or rocks or clay, right? To leave only the coal behind. Many of these boys would have worked probably about 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Okay, so textile mill, these are doffers. That was usually the first job that a child might have in a textile factory. Their job was to replace the spindle whenever it got full of the thread, and to make sure that there was a new one. So was there any regulation of child labor prior to 1938? I mean, no, not really, right? That's the short answer. While some northern states, such as Massachusetts, had child labor laws on the books, those measures basically regulated employment, but they didn't say that children couldn't work. They were just regulation of the actual employment. An example would be a state law limiting the hours that children could work to 10 hours daily. Let that sink in. That was the actual regulation. The 1900 census found that more than 1 in 5 children under the age of 15 were working in gainful employment. Reformers believed that the real rate was even higher. And I was just looking at some recent, studies now about child labor coming from EPI and others, and they say the same things today. We think this is the number of children that are working, but we know that it's higher, and so that remains true today. As industry kept growing and expanding, the numbers of child labor kept growing as well. While there were some meager state regulations in the North, the South had no regulations. And so Businesses, took advantage of the fact that there were lax regulations, no regulations, and so they were moving production to states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama to take advantage of their lax regulations. And cotton milling, right, these textile mills that you just saw a photograph and another one here of spinners in a North Carolina textile mill in 1903, became one of the most child labor intensive industries in the United States. By 1900, 1/4 of the South's nearly 100,000 textile workers were under the age of 16. I'm going to say that one more time. 1/4 of the South's nearly 100 textile workers were children under the age of 16. All right, so that's the problem, sort of just a snapshot. There's a lot more that could be said, but a snapshot of the problem. What about the movement, right, to end it? Well, since the 1870s, there had been people working at the state level to improve the situation in, certain locales, like maybe at the state level or local level, but there wasn't a national movement, right, to abolish child labor. So who were these people? How did they get involved? Why did they get involved? It was a lot of different people that cared about this issue. Mostly they were based in northern cities. They included educators. It's understandable why educators would be concerned about the problem of child labor. Religious leaders and ministers who were seeing the moral dimension of child labor and viewed it as sinful, as something immoral that should not be happening. One that might surprise you, I skipped one. Educated women that were often involved in the suffrage movement. Imperialists. This is the one that might surprise you. Imperialists that were worried about the strength of the U.S. nation. So this movement emerged around the same time as the Spanish-American War of 1898. And so some politicians that wanted the United States to be this global empire were seeing this as incompatible with a nation that had so many children and youth toiling in factories, that this was bad for their health, that they were going to grow up and not be able to serve in the military. They were not going to be able to, to be the strong sort of, a military force that could give the United States a global empire abroad. And so they were worried about it for reasons that, that most people are not aware of today, but it was an argument that was made in the United States Congress, that this was a reason why abolishing child labor was important for the United States and the strength of the nation. Advocates for immigrants and their treatment in American society, labor union activists, labor unions were all over this issue. They were worried about child labor, driving down wages, decreasing bargaining power. It was a big problem for labor unions. And then other people, advocates for play and leisure. This was a new movement at the turn of the century, that play was very important with a rising leisure culture and consumerism. Healthcare professionals that are just simply worried about how dangerous, and not even just the danger of losing limbs, but breathing problems that a lot of children had when they were working in coal mines and other types of environments that were unhealthy. And finally, social welfare state proponents. And there are actually more than that, but that's just to give you an idea of who were the people that were involved in this movement. All of these individuals kind of came together around 1904, right, to form a national child labor committee. They decided that they needed a national solution to this problem, because child labor was not a local problem, it was a national problem. And so their goals were twofold. One, they wanted to secure a federal law to abolish child labor, and two, they wanted to establish free compulsory education for all children. they started trying to get a federal law long before the famous 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, right? Back in 1906, they were trying to get a federal law, and right away, they were met with opposition. And so Southern industrialists, right, in those textile factories are the ones that, really fought them back. They brought up the Civil War, right? They brought this up as, Northern, that once again, just as the Union Army had tried to interfere with the institution of slavery, just as the Union Army had recently been in the South to abolish slavery from their midst and interfere with their institution of slavery, right? That this is happening all over again with industry in the South, and that industry is just getting started, and that they need the child labor to be the backbone of their workforce, so that this economy can be stimulated and can grow, and that once again, that the North was somehow going to come down and interfere with their economy. And so they had to deal with this. They had to be called lots of names, and including aggressive Northern interference. And so these Southern industrialists reached out to the mill families themselves. Don't you want these jobs? Don't you want your children to be able to work in these mills? And they got their support. And so a grassroots movement, counter movement, opposed to these, Northern interfering reformers developed on the ground. And so this opposition was able to defeat that law in 1906. Okay, some posters I just wanted to show you of the National Child Labor Committee trying to make people care about the issue. They had trouble, right? Just sort of getting public support in the beginning. Not a lot of people were sure what side that they wanted to fall on this issue. What if it was important for stimulating industry and growth? What if this is something that doesn't need a federal solution? Maybe it needed a local solution instead. And so more posters, everyone pays but few profit by child labor. The second poster was about the tenement houses, about how destructive that home work, this idea of entire families, mothers and children working in tenement houses in places like New York City, that it was destructive to family life. So their arguments weren't just about, they didn't want it to seem they're only talking about the cotton mills, that they were also talking about immigrant children in tenement houses in New York City, and that this was a national problem. And so with this information, reformers took their battle to the public in a national campaign depicting a greedy, sinful capitalist in a society that had somehow gone horribly wrong, right? These are child laborers pulling a capitalist who is sitting down and being leisurely as he's being pulled along by child workers and their mother. Another one where a child labor employer is being depicted as a heavy hand, pushing down on not caring for the health and well-being of young people. Another capitalist eating a child. Can't really get more explicit than that one. And so the images like these were distributed to the American public in newspapers, magazines, and posters after that first federal law was defeated in 1906, and continued until the 1910s, when another attempt at a federal law was made. Reformers continued to target the, quote, worst perpetrators of child labor in the Southern textile mills. This is one of their images that they distributed. Childhood is sacrificed daily so that profit may flow from every turn of a mill wheel, the altar of profit in that image. This is one that I found this image repeated in a lot of different literature. Okay, but those industrialists kept organizing against reform. In 1916, the National Child Labor Committee finally secured the first federal child labor law. It was named the Keating-Owen Act. This new law prohibited shipping products made with child labor across state lines. So that could have been the big victory. It seemed like it was going to be a big victory. But it wasn't over because the Southern industrialists had a plan, right? So remember that kind of grassroots movement that they had sparked? Well, now was the time to activate that movement, and so that's exactly what they did. At the kind of bequest of the Southern industrialist, a North Carolina mill worker, Roland Dagenhart, challenged this law in court on the grounds that it violated his rights as a parent to have his sons employed at that mill. And so this was the first really explicit example of using parental rights as the justification for continuing child labor. That case wound up before the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Mr. Dagenhart, saying that he was right? They agreed with him in Hammer v. Dagenhart in 1918, and so that overturned Keating, the Keating-Owen Act, and reformers were now back to the drawing board. So reformers tried again and failed again. So, it's this, I guess the opposite of a narrative of progress where you just sort of march to victory, right? That narrative of progress that I began with. So they tried again, this time using a different logic. This was the federal taxing power to tax the products of child labor, known as the Child Labor Tax Law. This law was also challenged in court by a Southern mill worker. In a decision known as Bailey v. Drexel Furniture Company, the Supreme Court struck down the child labor tax law as unconstitutional in 1922. And so this was a very discouraging moment. You can imagine how they must have felt, right, getting so close once again, and yet back to the drawing board once again. Okay, and so the final showdown, well, it's the final showdown if we're talking about, the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. It's not the final showdown if we're talking about today and what's happening today. So fed up with the United States Supreme Court for repeatedly overturning their federal child labor laws, reformers tried amending the U.S. Constitution. So this became a really popular idea in the progressive era, that it was something that other social movements had tried, that it was sort of a popular thing to get an amendment. The women's suffrage movement had gotten the suffrage amendment. Prohibition had gotten an amendment. And so many observers predicted that a child labor amendment would become the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, but they were wrong, right? And so I found newspapers where journalists would very confidently say that this was going to happen. It was an obvious next step, right? And so Southern industrialists kind of saw an opening here to solidify their influence, their cultural influence, by launching like a full-blown culture war against this amendment. And so they recruited not just their Southern mill families, but Midwestern farm families, urban Catholics, and many other people with this message about a government power grab to thwart parental authority. So any group that they thought would be sympathetic to the idea of parental authority being thwarted, they recruited them, they sent them literature. Free markets, they argued, were good, they were healthy, and so was the moral value of labor for young people. It worked. They defeated the child labor amendment with that argument. So that amendment was a dead letter by 1925, and opponents, this opposition movement, had managed to secure a huge victory in the midst of the progressive era. They had also managed to develop their own messaging, cultural messaging about this issue. Instead of just kind of court battles, this new battle was deeply personal, deeply cultural, about the role of parents and, whether government should be able to tell parents what to do with their own children. And that recipe really worked for them. The Great Depression changed the equation, at least temporarily. It took the Great Depression to finally secure a federal child labor law that stuck. Most Americans could agree at that time that all available jobs in the nation should go to adult workers rather than children. President FDR's New Deal included the first federal child labor laws not to be overturned by the Supreme Court. This 1938 law included provisions banning child labor under the age of 14 in most industries, while exempting children under 16 employed in agriculture remains a problem today, and children working for their parents in most occupations. So were reformers happy about it? Like, yay, the Fair Labor Standards Act? Not really. They kind of felt like it was disappointing, right? Like, because of what they had hoped for, the FLSA seemed like an 11th hour consolation prize more than a victory. And so publicly they called it a victory, but I found in their private correspondence with each other that they were more disappointed about it. The U.S. Children's Bureau estimated that it would touch only 1/4 of the child labor problem in the U.S., and one reformer, Grace Abbott, was really devastated and got very depressed about the Fair Labor Standards Act because it was so widely celebrated, and yet she felt that it was a, quote, mines and factories bill that would not protect all children in the country. Reformers tried reviving the child labor amendment after 1938 just to see maybe we could still get this thing. We have some possibly some support now that the FLSA is with us, but they were met with an emboldened opposition, right? Now this opposition was angry about the FLSA, and so they had a new source of resentment. These same industry groups that fought reformers every step of the way were now bitter about that passage of the FLSA. And so, although a legal victory, right, had been secured, underlying disagreements about capitalism, the federal government, labor, and parental rights were never resolved. And I just wanted to, I know I'm close to my time, but attempts to roll back child labor protections that we're seeing today, I think really echo this past. And so, this older battle, and as a historian that has studied this issue and written a book about it, it's kind of been remarkable, to see that happening. The business community is once again leading efforts to undermine labor protections for children. They're using very familiar arguments that sound very, for me, yeah, that's familiar. I've heard that before. The moral value of labor for young people, parental rights has been intoned again and again, the virtues of free market capitalism, and plenty of anti-government rhetoric, right, to justify loosening child labor laws at the state level today. U.S. child labor seems to be making something of a comeback. If you haven't noticed, since 2019, there has been an 88% increase in the number of children employed in violation of child labor laws. That's a statistic I got from the Department of Labor. At the end of 2023, 17 states have either enacted or introduced measures to loosen child labor laws. And you can see my 3 exclamation points because, it started out like it was, 6 or 7 states. And at this point, it's clear that there's something happening that is much more collective as an effort to loosen child labor protections. These different bills and acts aim, for the most part, to increase the number of hours that a child can work, extend the working hours a child can work later into the night, and to lower the age at which a child can work in certain jobs or industries, including, in some cases, hazardous work. All right, and I wanted to include some action steps. What can we do? I mean, there are many people that have written about this that can speak more to it than I can. I think increasing funding for enforcement is something that I've seen a lot of policy experts say that we need, closing loopholes that remain in the FLSA, supporting the passage of several new congressional bills that have been introduced. I mean, I was kind of shocked to see how many. So that's good news. Good news is that, you know, there's also new efforts to protect children in the workplace as a response, right, to the loosening of state-level restrictions. The Stop Child Labor Act, the Child Labor Accountability Act, the Preventing Child Labor Exploitation Act, and others. There's also a new campaign that I wanted to mention in case anyone is interested, because literally anyone could start using the tools that are on this website, like right now. Like you could do it right now, like from your phones. It is called US Child Labor, right? The website is uschildlabor.org, and basically it is a brand new campaign. I signed on to it as one of the first academics to be supportive of this campaign. You can find out what's happening in your own state using a child labor tracking map. You can write directly from the website. It will let you send you can write your message, type it in the website, send it directly to your representative, and it will even make suggestions for what you could ask them to do, expressing your concerns about changes to existing child labor protections. And if you want to learn more about the history of the battle over child labor in the United States, you can check out my book, Upon the Altar of Work, published in 2020. And there's so many other, juicy details. Like, this history is one that, I think a lot of people don't know it, but it is so important, and I hope that I have sparked your interest. Thank you so much.